Meanwhile, back in Dustwater, Charlie had taken a hard shine to his duties as sheriff. He patrolled the dusty boards at odd hours, stepping into the mercantile or the smithy without a lick of hurry, looking men square in the eye and keeping his counsel. The townsfolk would tip their hats with respect, and he'd give them a short nod, never much for grinning. Under the shadow of his Stetson, his gaze stayed stony, like he was hauling around a heavy thought he couldn't find a place to unburden. Clara Penrose watched him from the gloom of the hotel windows, feeling the mystery of the man coiled tighter around her heart. She'd gone and fallen for him hook, line, and sinker, but Charlie remained as unreachable as a high mountain peak. No matter how she tried to needle him, tease him, or talk him up, he'd listen, but his mind always seemed to be riding a different trail. One afternoon, the town's quiet was shattered by the bark of a 6-gun coming from the saloon. A trail-worn cowboy, sour because his pockets were too light for more whiskey, had started acting the fool. The local brew was a Rotka Poissier that couldn't fuddle a man's head if he drank a gallon, and the frustration had him drawing iron. He started plunging the bottles on the back bar, sending glass shards flying like hail. The patrons lit out of there like scalded cats. The barkeep dived behind the planks, shaken like a leaf. Nobody knew if the law had been fetched or if Charlie's own nose for trouble had brought him, but sure as sunset, the batwing doors swung wide. Charlie stood in the light, a peacemaker leveled in each hand. "The dance is over, son," he said, cool as a winter creek. The cowboy turned, swaying on his heels. "I don't give a plugged nickel for you," the drunkard spat. "Whole town knows you're sweet on the lady what runs the hotel." Charlie didn't blink an eye. He stepped in slow, boots ringing on the timber, his gaze fixed hard on the man. His spurs gave a slow, rhythmic jingle, a cold, metallic sound that brought a deeper silence than any shout. The cowboy tried to fetch his iron, but he was too slow by a mile. A heavy pistol but caught him across the temple, and he folded like a camp stool, cracking the table as he went down. Folks outside had their faces pressed to the window glass. The message was plain. This new sheriff wasn't one to be pushed. Charlie stepped out, fetched his lariat, and hog-tied the man's ankles before hitching the rope to his saddle horn. He gave his horse the spurs and dragged that limp sack of flour through the street dust all the way to the calaboose. He hoisted the drunk with one hand and tossed him into the cell like a bale of hay. The iron door slammed with a finality that echoed through the street. Charlie had no belly for trouble in Dustwater. He knew out here, the law moved slow, and usually left a bitter taste. The folks in town knew it too. Being so far from the reach of a circuit judge, they didn't put much stock in tin stars unless they had to. The trouble was, the mess had gone beyond a bit of rowdiness. Even if nobody was leaking blood, the saloon was a wreck. Broken glass and lead-riddled tables cost coin, and the cowboy in the cell didn't have 2 bits to rub together. Charlie swiped a hand over his brow and headed for the telegraph office. To James Butler Hickok. Vagrancy and lead tossin' in Dustwater. Need a judge. Send word post haste. The reply from Abilene came back short and sour. No men to spare. Call a town council. So, they rigged up a courtroom right there in the busted-up saloon. They pushed the tables back, swept up the glass, and let the smell of spilled rye and gunpowder hang in the air. 5 of the town's bigwigs sat up front, the mayor, the preacher, the key tapper, the station boss, and the local boxmaker. They were the jury now, deciding the fate of Earl, Red McKinnon. Clara Penrose stood by the bar, back straight and eyes sharp. She knew if the law didn't hold here, the town's heart would stop beating. Charlie stayed back by the wall, watching the door. He wasn't there to judge, he was there to make sure nobody reached for a rope before the talkin' was done. Outside, the town was split. Some were hollerin' for a necktie party to set an example. Others, mostly McKinnon's trailmates, were kicking up a fuss, claiming the law had no place boss and free men around. When Red McKinnon was hauled in, he looked like a kicked dog. The whiskey had worn off, leaving him with a head full of cobwebs and a sudden realizing that he'd stepped in it deep. The barkeep lit into him first, demanding $50 for the damage. Outside, the cowboys cheered for their man, their shouts leaking through the walls like a cold draft. McKinnon tried to plead his case, complaining about the sheriff's rough hand and the jailhouse mush that was fit for hogs. Charlie just spoke up quiet like, saying he ate the same mush every day and the calaboose wasn't meant to be no grand hotel. After some hushed palaver, the jury gave their word. The time he'd served was enough, but he'd have to fork over $30 and work off the rest fixin' what he'd smashed. McKinnon just hung his head. He knew he'd been licked. The town didn't take it well. The folks cravin' a hengine stomped off, feelin' cheated of a show. The cowboys, on the other hand, let out a war whoop and started tossin' their hats, thinkin' they'd won one over on the law. In the middle of the ruckus, Charlie stood still as a grave. He hadn't made a friend in the house. To the town, he looked weak. To the cowboys, he was a nuisance. He felt that tin star pullin' heavy on his vest. He realized then that in a town like Dustwater, the law ain't never loved. It's just a weight a man has to carry alone. After the trial, Dustwater was never the same. No bullet was fired, no gallows were raised, but the silence that followed was heavier than any violence. People didn't greet each other the same way anymore. Some looked over their shoulders when they saw Charlie on the street, others took shortcuts just to avoid passing him. Respect hadn't vanished, it had transformed into a form of suspicion. In the following days, rumors emerged. That he was too soft. That he was too harsh. That he sided with the town, not the people. That he sided with the law, not the West. No one seemed sure exactly what they held against him, but everyone seemed convinced that something was wrong. Kansas was changing. The towns were filling with poorly written rules and even more poorly applied ones. Politicians came with promises, judges were late, and the law always arrived after the dust had settled. Charlie no longer had patience for this. He knew how to stop a man with a look and a steady hand, but he didn't know, and didn't want, to live among papers, committees, and compromises. Clara Penrose was the only one who noticed the true change. Charlie spoke even less. He left the sheriff's office before sunrise and returned after sunset. Sometimes he didn't even enter the town at all, staying out on the plains, on horseback, staring aimlessly at the horizon. Like a man who was already packing his bags in his mind. There was no real farewell. That would have been too easy. On the evening before his departure, the man stopped by the hotel. Clara was at the desk, counting money and doing accounts, as always. She looked at him for a moment and knew. "You want to leave?" she said without reproach. Charlie nodded. He couldn't find words that didn't sound like an excuse. "For how long?" she asked. "I don't know." It was the only small lie he allowed himself. The truth was, he didn't plan on coming back. Clara stepped around the desk and stopped in front of him. She didn't touch him. She knew that if she did, he wouldn't leave. "You could stay," she said. "The town will get used to it." "I won't," he replied. They stood like that for a few moments, two people who understood too well what they were losing and why they were losing it. Clara offered him a handkerchief as a keepsake. "Take care of yourself, Charlie. You too." Then he walked out without looking back. She didn't even hear the door closing, but she felt the weight of it all night long. Charlie left one morning without witnesses. He left behind Dustwater and the beaten path to Abilene, then the endless prairie. He slept under the open sky, with his saddle for a pillow and his revolver close by. He ate little, and spoke even less. Each day on the road erased something of the man who had been sheriff. There was no official resignation. One morning, the star was no longer on his vest. The office was empty. The horse was gone from the pen. Dustwater moved on, as small towns do, forgetting quickly and judging poorly. Charlie didn't leave Kansas in a sudden burst. He left slowly, like a man who knows the place he's in no longer wants him, but isn't quite driving him out yet. After Dustwater, the sheriff's star had become a burden. It didn't protect him, it no longer represented him. It was holding him back. Texas didn't appear as a destination, but as a direction. South. Warm. Open. A place where work spoke before a name. He had heard of large ranches, of herds as far as the eye could see, of the constant need for men who knew how to ride, keep quiet, and hold their nerves. There, you didn't have to be righteous. You had to be useful. The road to Texas was long and unhurried. He passed through Oklahoma, past moving herds, through villages that were born and died in the same season. When he reached the coastal area, the air changed. It was humid, heavy, smelling of salt and rich earth. Horses tired differently there. People did too. In Matagorda County, no one asked him who he had been. He was only asked if he knew how to keep a herd together, if he could stay awake at night, and if he knew how to shoot only when necessary. He answered briefly. He was hired on the spot.